All right, sorry for my malfunction. So look, I'm going to talk about things that are meaningful or important to me. 10 years ago, I didn't think that becoming a VP of engineering takes me into this path of thinking about engineering leadership, and it did. So we'll talk about you build it, you run it, and how we are able to leverage this concept to care and to grow a culture where employees actually care. Oftentimes, when you hear you build it, you run it, it's shortcut for your ass is going to be on the line to receive a call at 2 a.m. when the service goes down, right? You build it, you run it, you get to be on call. And I think that what I want to talk about is how we discovered this concept to be something different, something that enables us to open up the dimensions of what it actually means to care as an engineer. And through that, be able to talk about what does it mean for you to be skilled and to grow in your skill. So the way we started is like how everybody else starts, right? Accountability problems. Sales engineering, product engineering, marketing engineering, sales product. There's always a gap in accountability somewhere. And for us, there's no difference. And we've had this in engineering as well, particularly around traditional engineering and operations. And there's nothing new here. Everybody knows the slides. They are repeated for the last 30 years, right? So we can do better. And despite all the literature, all the knowledge, all the talks that we've all been a part of for the last 10 years, we still have this eternal problems, these struggles. We still haven't figured it out, right? So at the surface level, when you think about you build it, you run it, obviously the basics are, yes, developers take ownership, you build reliable maintenance, you build reliable code and blah, blah, blah. Of course that happens. But something else fundamentally happens. We are growing the scope of the engineering experience. And it's very important to recognize that and to lean into that, right? We are teaching employees how to tackle ambiguity directly, right? And we start to learn what it means to be accountable. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what accountability actually means, at least for us, as how we are thinking through developing culture and developing leadership, engineering leadership at our company. Now, this is really tough work, right? I mean, when you think about a culture of you build it, you run it, right? All of a sudden, a company starts developing a culture towards clear expectations about what happens during an incident response. Being able to start thinking about running engineering organizations as a business from the perspective of being able to forecast SLO KPIs, and does the work that I'm actually doing lead to the results that I'm planning to impact. The ultimate question for us, at least as managers and as leaders, is to be able to answer the question, why the hell are you my manager? Like, why are you my manager? And what am I here to learn from working with you for the next 12 months, 24 months, or maybe longer, right? And again, we found that you build it, you run it, gives us a structure and a framework through which we can talk about how engineering experience can grow into, what do we expect our engineers to learn, to grow, and to actually set expectations of their abilities to have an impact. Now, I'll tell you what, the challenges here, it's not necessarily going through a playbook and do an incident response or incident management. It's not following the workflow or the processes or the best practices. That's not the challenge. The challenge is being able to demonstrate to an employee why they being more concise, more specific, more persuasive, more analytical, more visionary, ultimately evolves themselves and our overall practice together. So the responsibility of management that is for us is to be able to develop employees in that way, right? And again, we find that structuring conversations on a larger concept like you build, you run it, gives us a uniform way to talk about why the shit is actually important. Without a concept like you build it, you run it, it's a little bit harder to be persuasive. It's like, oh, just do this better, just do something else better, right? So it's really good for us to have a unifying concept. And I don't know about you, but there aren't that many concepts that are so effective in being able to demonstrate and grow leaders. Maybe you have more. I think I have 2 or 3, and this is one of them. But there really aren't many, and it takes a lot of work to be able to identify that. So we'll go through an example of Sentry. It's nothing novel. If you've worked in the industry for over 10 years, you've probably encountered this because everybody in the world encounters this. We encountered it too, and yet it served as a catalyst for us to do better, to expect more from each other, to expect more from our organization, and to really create a culture that teaches engineers what it means to be engineers. So in 2021, we had an incident. I think it's incident 27. And our ingestion pipeline was degraded for about 12 hours because it took that long to figure out what the hell is happening. And obviously, you know, everybody goes back and forth. What happened? I don't know. What changed? I don't know. Every company is going to have something like this every year. There's nothing new here, right? So obviously, you get chaos that ensures from all of these discussions. And when you have a tradition, at least for us, when we had this traditional engineering operations model, oh, shit broke, ingestion pipeline is backlogged, scale up workers to dequeue the Kafka queue, right? And all that kind of stuff. And then we noticed that these solutions didn't actually work. And quite honestly, in my experience, it's very rare to have solutions that actually work in a horizontal scale. It's really hard to design that. At least for us, given that payload for us changes quite often. But anyway, in 2022, that didn't happen for us. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what happens. And the reason, and it took, again, 12 hours to get it done. We actually had to write code to figure out the things that we're running into and be able to fix it. So it wasn't an obvious problem. And all of this really is to highlight that when you're early on, obviously like we were, right? You just code, push, release, everything runs. And not many people have the mindset of understanding what actually happens throughout the whole pipeline, what happens with the backend services, and to what degree the load that you have in one part of the system is able to create congestion or overload stuff downstream. And sure, startups move fast, and we ran into those problems like probably you run into those problems too. And afterwards, we started to be a little bit more practical or a little bit more thoughtful about what sort of an engineering culture do we want to have that helps us develop engineering leaders that have more foresight in how we deliver software, right? And what are we actually accountable to? I think that's a very important question. What is engineering accountable to? What is an engineer accountable to when we are actually pushing code to production? So through these reflections and discussions, we started to be a little bit more, maybe grown up, mature, any word you use is probably fine. But we started to get into this idea that, look, incident management is a part of the engineering culture, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you just go process. It means that the manager is able to observe how the engineering team is participating and be able to give corrective feedback or feedback that makes engineers more effective during these engagements, right? SLO health checks are how we now track the level of accountability that we have at the company, right? Before we didn't have it, now we do it. It's a big dashboard to say, hey, are you meeting the responsibilities that you set forth when you actually build the servers? It took a big fight for us to get incident follow-up actions on as milestones we actively work around it, right? And maybe for you, you don't have these challenges, but for us, we did. And in getting engineers to prioritize incident follow-up actions are actually necessary, not just, oh, I'm going to do it eventually. No, you're going to do it by the end of the month. And at the end of the day, unfortunately, we still live in a world where nothing really happens if you don't tie it up with performance management. Like, as persuasive as you are, as great as a manager as you are, chances are that you need to codify all of this in how you do performance assessment and yearly reviews so that you can be a nice guy with a gun, right? I'm going to be a nice manager, but I'm also going to carry a gun. Because you need these incentives, you need this way of positioning why something is important to compel folks to act. So the thing is that, like, what we did, we take the concept of, hey, look, you're accountable for what this service runs in production. You build it, you run it. But that means that there's a lot of different things that we must start being very attentive to, right? And all of a sudden, we opened up to say, hey, look, if you want to be a good engineer, you have to perform well during incident management discussions, right? And that means you are prepared, you're concise, you're specific, you listen, and you engage in a way that enables us to close on issues faster than otherwise. And we have managers that we set expectations that, hey, your job in these meetings is to see how your engineers operate and be able to level them up. That is because we started focusing on taking something like you build it to run it and start thinking about, hey, we need engineers skilled enough to where we excel via you build it, you run it, versus we need engineers that just do a process. The same thing, like, for example, we have SLOs. When an SLO goes a little bit down, folks are actually, they get feedback, and we have very serious conversation about, we need a story of why this is happening, right? And is it going to fix today, tomorrow, or never? Right? Just driving the discussions to create extreme clarity around why something is important. Are you going to live up with it? If so, write it down so we know how we make decisions. And ultimately, right, we have to evaluate engineering leadership on our ability to grow engineers, not on just doing stuff, right? And in that, articulate what it means to grow engineers. Like, what are the dimensions of growth that you want your engineers at the company to develop, to manifest, to influence others? And in doing that, right, our managers need to be skilled at doing that and evaluated on their ability to drive a vision of what engineering is developing at the company. So I think I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this slide because I feel like this slide is the heart of it. When we think about culture, at least to us, culture is how we work together. And in that sense, culture is the subset of the behaviors, the expectations, and how we interact with each other to achieve our shared goals. Right? That is important. This is what culture is. Culture is how we all work together. And I feel like if you followed so far, you see, you build it, you run it, enables us to create a culture that is being defined by a particular set of behaviors, a particular expectation of what does it mean to be skilled, what does it mean to influence, how attentive you are towards something. And when you break it all up into little pieces and put it together in a bowl, that is what culture is. The second thing is the idea that accountability keeps your next self within reach. And here's the thing, when I think about accountability, oftentimes like, oh, you're accountable to something, right? But it's not that, right? Accountability, the heart of it, is what we owe each other. What we owe each other is what makes us accountable to each other. Right? So there's always a vision of, hey, at Sentry, what do you owe engineers? What do you owe customers? What does an engineer owe customers? And there's this idea of what we owe each other that ultimately starts creating a sense of what does it actually mean to be accountable. And this is important because the motivation changes. Right? The driving force behind why accountability is relevant changes. And to me, this is culture defining. And the last thing to highlight right now, and I think it's a shared sentiment, but despite being a shared sentiment, it still needs to be talked about, is that direct confrontation is how we grow and how we harden. Right? And I find that when you start taking a culture of you bring it, you run it, from the perspective we've developed at Sentry, right? You encourage a direct confrontation without being conflict-oriented. Because at the end of the day, the goal that everybody has is extreme clarity towards what is happening, what are the expectations, what happens when those expectations are not being met, how do you change expectations, and so on, right? But to get to these answers, you're always actually going to put people in a comfortable position because not everybody knows or is skilled enough to manage ambiguity or to be able to manage through all of this. It is quite honestly like, imagine a room of 7-year-olds and you need them to be 11-year-olds, and then you need them to be 13-year-olds. And when you are 13-year-olds, you can actually build spaceships together. Right? But it takes a level of maturity of how to deal with conflict, how to deal with stress, ambiguity, complexity, and so on and so forth. And for us, again, in conclusion, for us, we've been able to leverage this concept of you build it, you run it, and start building almost a program of what engineering is and what engineering needs to become. That's all I have.
All right, let's give it up for Vlad. So, yeah, please use the Slido link for questions. We have one coming in, but I wanted to ask you, Vlad. Well, first, I just want to say thank you for your presentation. I know for me, when I put, like when I'm leading a project, I always try to put accountability at the forefront of it because I know that that's how people will actually follow through with doing the thing that we need them to.
Yeah.
So what? My question to you actually is like, let's say you're leading a project and you want to have this accountability at the forefront. What sort of things would you incorporate into the process to make sure that that is included, throughout the life cycle of the project?
Let's do something else. When I talked about accountability, I talked it in the frame. I didn't talk about it as a checklist. Hey, you have to have a plan ready, release plan ready. You need to define the performance characteristics of a new server and expectations, right? I didn't start with that. What I did is when we think about accountability, the root of accountability is around, again, what we owe each other. So when you're a leader, what do you owe your team, right? You owe clear expectation settings about what a good plan looks like. And that's more important than putting together, you need to meet this bar of accountability, right? And I think that's really, really important because in leaders, your best way to influence is through clarity, clear expectation of what success looks like, what it means for you to be a good engineer, what it means for you to have a proper, credible plan that can be followed up through. So in my role, it's like, hey, a credible plan has these elements. It needs to be followed through. You need to understand what to expect, and so on and so forth, right? So my job, really, in that way, is to show, demonstrate, or highlight what a good plan looks like, and be able to evaluate or be able to comment on that, rather than set up the guiding post for it.
So you're setting an example.
Yeah, well, setting an example, or rather being able to develop people's understanding of what credibility, a credible plan, an action plan looks like. and get them to be able to execute that way.
Got it. Okay, cool. Thank you. So let's jump to the Slido questions. Let's see here. Okay. We have first one here. How do you compare direct confrontation with blameless postmortem? Yeah, I love this one.
It's about maturity, actually. I think that, I don't know, I don't have a good answer other than say, hey, we need to grow up. We need to be more mature. And at the end of the day, you have to be, in post-mortems, you have to be direct. If you're not direct, you're avoiding personal responsibility. You have to be direct. You have to talk about the reality of what has happened and misses. And oftentimes, misses about people miss something. It's not a process. It's always somebody missed something. And that's okay. The challenge is what happens afterwards, right? And to be able to actually have these conversations, you have to be mature. You have to be more mature than probably you were yesterday, and recognize that the only thing that's important are the next steps. But not driving towards confrontation usually evades the reality and evades accountability, right? And the goal, again, is to develop a culture that is able to manage this tension, but not to do without it.
Got it. Let's go to the next one. With you build it, you run it, how do you disambiguate between infra errors and application errors? The key idea here is that many times SRE teams get burnt out.
Yeah, it sucks, I know. Dude, SRE is not, we try to make SRE be an engineering job and increase the quality of life for people in the operations organization, right? And right now it's, in any company, by the way, not just Sentry, but throughout the industry, SRE is not an enviable job. And the goal of you build it, you run it, is to start having this transformation where SREs is not the people that clean up after yourself when you have a mess that it's convenient for you to not look at on a Sunday afternoon, right? So you don't disambiguate it. Okay, I think that there is something else to this question that I conveniently overlooked. I feel like you can look at cloud engineering sort of work, traffic shaping, load balancing, and things like that, right? And that can say, hey, this is a lot more of an infrastructure concern. And that's fair, and I feel like that's where the SRE operations can take on those traffic shaping or infrastructure sort of challenges. But when it comes to services not working, that is when you have to really actually make sure that engineers really understand the operational parameters that you work within, and we think ahead of time in solving them.
Cool. All right, let's go to the next one. We have in you build it, you run it model. Does that mean each team has their own on-call rotation?
Not each team, no. The fight. No, not each team. So the teams who don't want to do that, the directors are on call. So if a director doesn't want to get their team on call, that's fine, but we need a number. And then the director can figure out how he's going to manage that situation. Some teams are on call, but the teams that don't, again, we just have the director of engineering on call, and he's going to manage it. That is the truce we've made.
I could definitely see that being very interesting.
Yeah,
no, I'm not knocking at all. No, I think that's very. The error rate will definitely go down if that's the case. All right, cool. So, do you have IC champions to be exemplars of this culture as opposed to being a top-down edict?
So I'm here talking about this, but that doesn't mean that this is a top-down edict. Nothing works if our senior engineers, our engineers aren't role model of this mindset. Nothing, right? And I'm lucky enough or privileged enough to actually have people, to work with people who actually understand that how you care is important. How you care makes you impactful. And how you care is actually caring. And our ICs have been able to actually develop into this culture building, because at the end of the day, what we are after is making sure that the next engineer and the next engineer, the next engineer, right, learns from our ICs that are growing up, or they're growing this culture into Sentry.
Got it.
Yeah.
So let's, I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Let's go to, how do you bridge the communication gap between DevOps and engineers? Engineers have a hard time grokking DevOps vocabulary.
Get them drunk. No. I don't know, to me, it's always the question, if people have a hard time grokking the vocabulary of somebody else, that means that they're not communicating enough. There's too much silos, there's too much of a chasm, and why the hell is that the case? Right? So if that ever is the case, other things need to be worked out. What needs to be worked out is being able to make sure that how about this? Operations people are engineers. They're not different things, right? At Sentry, operations people pass the same engineering interviews like everybody else. And if ever we see a chasm like this develop, it's indicative of a cultural problem, and that needs to be addressed. Though I haven't seen, at least at Sentry, we tend to be, maybe we got lucky, but we tend to be pretty good with this.
So you're saying there's some sort of cultural problem at play? Just to make sure I understand.
Well, what I'm saying is that when you have this chasm where engineers don't understand the DevOps vocabulary, I believe that there's more of a cultural problem at play, in the sense of those folks are not talking to each other enough to understand their concerns, to understand what do you look at, what's important to you when discussing something.
Got it. Cool. All right. I think that brings us up on time. We are going to do our one question that we've been doing for all speakers. So, yeah, what is one book that you would recommend to the audience that has changed the way you work or live your life?
There are so many good books, and they're all impactful. But, okay, yeah, I think, no, definitely. So how will you measure your life? So that's a book that I've read, and I'm asking everybody who moves into manager role at Sentry to read that book. It's almost like an hour reading curriculum to move into management role, and you cannot move into management role without reading 3 books. This is the first one of them. So I very much grew, learned, and got inspired by that book. I read it once a year, actually.
It's How Do You Measure Your Life, you said?
Yeah.
Oh, who is it by?
Clayton Christensen.
Oh, okay. Got it. Cool. Yeah, thank you so much, Vlad. All right, let's give it up for Vlad.